Democracy means different people working together.
But these values are being threatened by misinformation. False information that masquerades as truth. Online, it can spread like wildfire. Destroying public discourse. Eroding trust. And dividing communities. Creating echo chambers that reinforce false beliefs. To safeguard our democracy, we must address this problem. At the News Literacy Project, we believe education is the solution. Our resources teach people how to sort fact from fiction, to separate opinion from news. We've created powerful teaching tools, like Rumor Guard, professional learning, informative newsletters, and Checkology, our interactive online learning platform.
So today's Checkology lesson is on misinformation. Which one of these is an example of manipulated content?
We've already reached millions of young people, equipping them with the essential skills for a complex media landscape.
Fabricated content is misinformation that is designed to deceive you into thinking that it's real.
And helping them become engaged participants in our democracy. But we're just getting started. We're expanding our reach so that every American has the tools to decipher fact from fiction. At the News Literacy Project, we're reclaiming facts. Because we all have the right to be informed, empowered, and engaged. In this democracy, every American has a role to play. By taking responsibility for our media habits, together, we can build a nation founded on facts, where informed citizens shape the future of the country. Join us in the fight against misinformation.
Ready, that's it. All right.
Our democracy depends on it.
Good afternoon. I'm Chuck Salter, the president and CEO of the News Literacy Project, and I'm thrilled to welcome this distinguished panel of journalists who anchor and report on some of the most highly regarded news programs in America. I have no doubt you will enjoy the program. There was a time when major news outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, and their high-profile anchors told a shared story of important issues in the United States and the world. They strove to ensure their reporting was based on solid facts and credible sources, setting the narrative about issues facing our nation and the relevance to their audience's lives. The first time I remember paying close attention to a major news event was when the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart after takeoff in January 1986. I was in the 5th grade. My family, like millions of others, counted on the reporting of the networks to understand and to process this disaster. As indispensable and fact-based as the media was then, it was hardly perfect. A lack of diversity in newsrooms, and editors' and reporters' blindness to issues and stories of great importance to people different from them, all led to serious gaps in how audiences understood the world. But serious journalism has worked to overcome those shortfalls, and it remains a work in progress. But those days, with the good and the bad, have been upended by the rise of the internet and social media. Tech companies and not trained journalists are now dominating both advertising and public news consumption. And purveyors of mis and disinformation use social media platforms to spread misleading and false content designed to spark outrage and sow confusion. These distortions often become the prevailing narratives for far too many people. And the evolution of the 24-hour news cycle has fueled the ascendancy of partisan pundits, whose rhetoric has helped polarize our nation even further. The result is a decline in trust in news media, respected institutions, and government leaders. This decline threatens our democracy. But despite the industry upheaval, standards-based news organizations remain an important bulwark in protecting our democracy. Voters cannot make informed choices about the issues that affect their lives unless they have access to fact-based information from sources they can rely on and trust. And that's why we're holding this event today. We will learn how these journalists will ensure their reporting is fair, fact-based, and relevant, how they will decide what issues and candidates to cover, and how they will counter election-related misinformation. Yes, our information ecosystem is fractured and filled with falsehoods, but we believe that in being transparent about their internal decision-making processes, news leaders can help us rebuild trust in journalism. These journalists reach tens of millions of people and are committed to holding our leaders accountable. We're very pleased to have them here. I'll also note that we did invite Brett Baer of Fox News to participate today, but he was unable to join us. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsor of today's event, Politics and Prose Bookstore, and our co-hosts, Kathy Merrill-Williams and Archie Smart, and of course, the National Press Club. And finally, our moderator today is David Folkenflik. David is NPR's media correspondent, reporting on how journalism is practiced, on the people who shape the news, and on the challenges the press faces. His work has appeared in prestigious national and international outlets. Earlier in his career, David worked as a reporter for the Baltimore Sun and the Durham Herald-Sun in North Carolina. And he was the editor of his college paper at Cornell University. He's also the author of Murdoch's World, The Last of the Old Media Empires. And with that, I'll turn things over to David.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We have with us a kind of murderer's row of political journalists. A finer collection of Washington journalists have probably not dined together since Tim Russert dined alone. So we're appreciative of them making time. Busy day, a day in which events in Atlanta, events in New York with political import, things here in Washington and abroad, of course, and yet they've made this time, so our thanks to them. I'd like to, not that they really need an introduction, but introduce each of them to you briefly. Kristen Welker, of course, is host of NBC's storied Sunday public affairs show, Meet the Press, NBC as well. We have Major Garrett, chief Washington correspondent for CBS News, had covered the White House for myriad institutions, print and broadcast and cable alike, has done the duopoly of CNN and Fox in his career, and currently also host of The Takeaway, the podcast as well. We have with us Mary Bruce, has joined us. She's a White House correspondent for ABC News, has worked for ABC for some time, and I can't imagine how she has time to be here today, but we're grateful for that. And my former colleague, Jeff Bennett, the co-host of the PBS NewsHour, former colleague of Kristen's at NBC News. Welcome to Jeff as well. So quick show of appreciation for our panelists, if you will. We're intending to reserve some significant time for questions from the audience and from those who may be viewing remotely and streaming, C-SPAN and YouTube, I want to be able to drill down, ask some serious questions of each, but also maybe a couple of quick, maybe lightning round questions, if you would. One question that I get asked or hear from people who are not journalists is, who are you talking to? Who do you imagine your audience to be? Let's start with you, Jeff. Who do you think of yourself as speaking to when you're presenting the show?
It's such a great question, and one of the fantastic things about the PBS NewsHour is that I get to actually meet and interact with our viewers so frequently. We go all around the country to speak with viewers at different member stations. And so it's true that most viewers of linear television happen to be older, so 65 and older. They're civically engaged. These are people who vote. They're people who pay attention to current events. Oftentimes I have in the back of my head that there are viewers watching a specific segment who probably are experts on the topic that I'm talking to our guest about. So that's always floating around in my head too, that you always have to be prepared and to have 3 and 4 in some cases follow-up questions. So that tends to be who I envision our audience as, people who are deeply invested in the news, who are paying close attention to what's happening, who tend to skew a little bit older, and who really just live in every part and corner of this country. Yeah. That's particularly true of public media.
Let's go through each of you briefly.
Yeah, I think in addition to obviously knowing sort of the demographic, obviously network news tends to skew a little bit older, across the country. I think I often try to think about the fact that our audience is very diverse, politically minded as well. We are speaking to a divided country every night, and I think you can't forget that. I also often think about the lives that everyone lives and how busy everybody is. You're aware when you're on a morning television program, when it's Good Morning America at 7 a.m. I know you are trying to pour coffee, get out the door. You want someone to help you understand what is going on quickly, easily. People are living incredibly busy lives. And when you spend the time to come home at 6:30 and turn on the news, most people know what's happened in the day, but to really find a way to make it digestible, put in the right context, make it clear why this really matters, given everything that's going on, to try to cut through some of that noise. I think that is something that I think about a lot.
Derek, you have you have on your Twitter feed, I think, a line saying this is a transmitter, not a receiver.
Correct.
Who are you transmitting to in your mind, ideally?
So that was only my way of telling people who followed me on Twitter or X that I'm not going to be reading your comments. I just don't. I just don't engage at that level. I put out what I'm doing, I put out what I think is interesting, and I leave it at that. I don't engage, it's too time consuming, and it can be a doom scrolling, deeply negative process more often than not. When I think about our audience, I think about the currently curious and the just now curious. And I think the biggest added value that anyone who has the luxury and the opportunity to work at and I know this is a pejorative term, but I don't think of it as one, legacy media company. No, a legacy media company means you've been around for a long time. And you have an established record and an established audience that has allowed you to attain that hard-to-achieve legacy status. I don't consider it a pejorative. I consider it a privilege, is to take people who are aware but not yet curious and meet their needs because they're curious for the first time and they're hungry for someone to tell them about something that they're interested in. And we try to find as many different ways to do that at CBS as possible. Not only with the sort of tent poles of the morning show and the evening show, but our CBS News streaming that is available 24 hours a day. I created a podcast, it's in its 8th year, called The Takeout, that is an interview program that our guests are never edited. It's principally about politics and policy, but a little bit of pop culture. It's a space where people know they can hear a continuous conversation that is not hacked up by the false compression of time that sometimes is necessary in broadcast news. So we're trying to do those ways of meeting the needs of the currently curious, but also find the newly curious so they'll maintain their curiosity and stay with us.
Kristen, I see you nodding at that.
Well, it's one of our guiding principles, I think, at Meet the Press. When we think about who our audience is at Meet the Press, these are people who are tuned in to politics, who are tuned into news. They may skew a little bit more senior. These are also families who are getting up, as Mary said, on a Sunday. I envision them making waffles, kind of slowly easing into the day. And it's also a very divided nation. So I strive to make sure that our discourse is reaching everyone across the political spectrum. That means making sure that we're bringing in voices from all across our political spectrum and even outside of our political spectrum. We've started a new segment on Meet the Press called Meet the Moment, where we've highlighted people like Selma Blair, who's spoken about Black women and the high rate of mortality for Black women in pregnancy. Allison Felix. Selma Blair, who's spoken about her disabilities. And I think it's just so important that we are expanding the voices that we're hearing from everyone. I'm also acutely aware that we want to reach those newer audiences, younger audiences. I think that that's so important. It's such an important part of bringing in everyone into the conversation, because we started off talking about misinformation and disinformation. We want everyone to be included in these conversations.
So let's talk a little bit and make this brief, because we're going to drill down. But let's start making things a little tangible here. All of you are experienced political journalists. All of you have been involved in recent years. This race that we're looking at in the presidency, 2024, appears to be, nothing's, they haven't had the conventions yet, appears to be set with the same two people who ran in 2020. In a sentence or two at most, what have you learned from 2016 and 2020 campaign coverage that makes you want to do something differently this time around?
In two sentences?
I'll let you unpack perhaps, but I want to hear sort of the range of what might be.
One of the things that I think is so important that we learned in 2016 is to, and I will try to be as concise as possible, make sure that we are spread out all across this country in between election years. So that means, as moderator of Meet the Press, I was in Iowa 6 months before the caucuses, but we've also had teams of people and reporters throughout this country to make sure that we're keeping our finger on the pulse of what voters are saying.
Okay. Andrew?
So the two most important things in this election as compared to 2016 and 2020 for us, I believe, will be talking to voters as rapidly and as persistently as possible and taking their voices and actually putting them on air. I will tell you something that all of us know and regret, but it's a truism, or has been. Network executives have all told us, go get the voters. We bring back voters, and what's the first thing that's cut? The voters. Well, there's some other news. We got to do that. It's more important than some person in some place. And what I've begun to do internally is push back and say, no, that's going to be the last thing that we should cut. We want to hear from people because they give voice, and we went out to search for it, so let's hold it and also hold it up. The other thing I will say, in answer to your question, David, is if it is going to be Biden and Trump, and there's plenty of reason to believe that it is, then the horse race part is over, so let's do the thing that we don't typically do, which is, how are they different? What are these actual issues? What will America look like if what they say they want to do actually happens? And burrow in on that and do some of that reporting, because if the horse race is over, we have lots of time to fill, so let's fill it with what's going to happen.
I think, well, picking up firstly on one thing that Major said about getting out and speaking to voters, and not to go off topic here, but one of the things that I think is really challenging about this race is you have two candidates that have demanding day jobs or demanding other legal schedules, shall we say, that take them off of the campaign trail. And traditionally, we would be out going to 3-4 campaign rallies a day. So you are spending your life talking to voters. And really, I think it's one thing that we all love about being out on the campaign trail. Now, the president obviously isn't on the campaign trail in the traditional way. Donald Trump isn't either. And so it means that you have to be much more intentional about going out there and seeking out those stories, because you're not just traveling the country day in and day out in the same kind of way because of the nature of this race. I think one other thing which is, I know, a constant conversation in every newsroom is, just the basic conversation of what to give time to. When is a comment worth paying attention to and worth highlighting? When is it not? When is it worth doing 3 pieces on what someone says about NATO? And when is it worth saying, look, that's just an inflammatory comment that we don't need to draw attention to? And I think that's been a constant arc of learning for, I think, all of us. And when to focus on the horse race and when to focus on the issues. And I know I've had the same conversation internally as well about the silver lining of the fact that you don't have to cover the horse race as much, is that you can say, okay, well then let's go out and do some enterprising stories. Let's get out there and dig into the issues. That said, I'm just excited to be out of the White House for an hour, so it is often very hard to break away given everything else that's happening, but there's an opportunity in the fact that it is set so early. It lets you go out and cover the race a bit from the outside in.
Yeah, I think that's a constant across all of our newsrooms. I wasn't with the NewsHour back in 2020, but I think for any election that is so defined by the personalities, in as much as Biden v. Trump is, it's important to also focus on the policy and not just pay attention to what the candidates are saying, but also pay attention to what they are doing and what they will do. And so for Joe Biden, who hasn't really articulated much of a plan for what he would do if he was reelected, like is he going to extend the Biden-Trump cut or the Trump tax cuts? Taking a look at that, if Donald Trump says he wants to be the revenge and retribution for his supporters, what does that actually mean? If he's trying to tank the immigration talks that are happening on Capitol Hill, then why? And what is his prescription for solving the problem at the border? And so focusing on those kinds of issues to the degree that we can.
There's something very interesting about this race that is sort of omnipresent and yet not explicitly done. We essentially have two presidents running against each other, and they have each almost a full term in office that you can kind of compare. But it feels as though it's a race where you have an incumbent and a challenger, and that the 3.5 years has not wiped away our memory. We're focusing a lot on the legal challenges. Some of them have to do with his time in office and unwillingness to release the office, and yet it doesn't feel to me as though what Jeffrey's talking about is fully evident. That is to say, well, look, you've got records here. You can compare them. Mary Bruce, talk about that phenomenon a little bit in terms of thinking about these two presidents that are about to go right at each other.
What's also interesting is that they're very much running the exact same campaigns. It's not just, 2024 feels so much like 2020 in the sense that, from my perspective at the White House, Biden it's the same argument. It's even the same slogan in a lot of ways. The former president is a threat to democracy and that he is the best one to prevent him from doing damage going forward. But it is interesting. They do have records, and you're not looking at that because I think from the president's perspective, what's at stake is so important that they put that first, right? Our democracy is on the line, and that is their guiding principle in this campaign. And because of that, they're not sitting there, picking apart necessarily every little thing that Trump did in the past, because they're also highlighting what he's going to do in the future. That said, I'm sure they'd be happy if we spent more time doing that. But so much of it is about the danger that they argue is coming ahead.
So, Mary, to drill down a little bit further, you mentioned earlier the question of him saying, he would tell Russia to do whatever the hell they want to NATO members who hadn't paid their dues, as he puts it, not necessarily an accurate characterization of what those financial contributions really are doing there. It seems like at a moment where Russia is in the middle of a conflict that we clearly have taken a side on, and we are voting on how much money to give to their opponent in this conflict, it seems as though Russia is sort of a front and center question. On the other hand, I do remember 2016, we were all whipsawed by pretty much anything he would say off the cuff in every tweet. How are you guys parsing that? And what serves the public's, to me, one of the great things about the News Literacy Project, right, is that the notion is what quietly undergirds, I think, what we do at NPR, and I'm sure you guys feel that you do, but it's that we're trying to equip people to act as citizens and not just consumers of information, right? So what is serving the public on a question like that?
And it's a robust conversation in every newsroom, I think, because both of these candidates, regardless of any race, you have to decide what's the story tonight, how are you framing it, what sound bites, what quotes, what are you using? And it is a constant conversation, I think, especially because, look, there were some lessons learned, I think, from 2016 in terms of how to cover Donald Trump and the unconventional candidate that he is. You don't want to chase every single bouncing ball, but certain comments are not that. And recognizing what is just inflammatory and meant to gain attention versus what is really, substantial. And when you're talking about what, a potential future president is going to do, that's important. That, to your point, is important information for voters as they are making an informed decision. And certainly, I think once the current president seizes on those comments and there's a real robust conversation and you're in the midst of a funding fight and Russia is, allegedly close to putting nuclear weapons in space, all of this becomes a really important part of the conversation. But I think sometimes I wonder, and I certainly hope, that our viewers recognize and are aware that this is not something that any journalist in Washington and any newsroom takes lightly. There are serious conversations about what comments are worthy of airtime and worth really making sure that you have robust conversations around.
Kristen Welker, hop in here.
I think there have been, to Mary's point, some real changes that have taken place since 2016. For example, in 2016, you'd be standing in front of the camera, a tweet would come in, you would read it, 5 seconds after it came onto your phone,
which had just burst in flames.
Right. And we no longer do that. I mean, we take a beat, whether it's a tweet, whether it's a speech. Do we carry it live? Do we carry it on tape and do playback and do, fact checking along the way? I think there have been a number of changes in that regard. I also think when you talk about the sheer volume of news and headlines that's coming at you every day, I think that there's more of a robust discussion, as Mary says, to take a step back and say, let's put this all into context so that we're not just saying, here's the shiniest object today, so that we're saying, this happened, but here was the broader backdrop.
And yet, to refer back to something Mary said early on, when you're thinking of all these trials and legal challenges, Trump comes out there, he makes sure he finds a lobby or a setting in front of a courtroom, usually with either a seal or flags behind him, and he turns that into essentially a campaign event, right? And look, he is entitled to speak to the public and should. He's a candidate for the highest office in the land. How do you decide how to carry that? I mean, there's the tension of how do you cover it, and also tension of whether you're letting him just sort of speak to the nation directly.
Right, and I think sometimes we take those moments live and sometimes we don't, and we look at them first and process them first and then decide what, we're going to play back. But I do think you are witnessing this extraordinary moment where you have a former president who's facing all of these legal challenges. The public has a right to see that. If we do take something live, to make sure that we're there ready to do fact-checking if and when necessary, whether it's Trump, whether it's someone else, to make sure that we are giving that proper backdrop and background information for people to process it so that they're getting the actual facts as they come in.
Kristen, I want to stick with you for a moment. You came under fire for a recent interview you did with Lee Stefanik, senior House Republican from upstate New York. She comes on Meet the Press. She refers to people who have been jailed over charges in regard to the January 6th insurrection and siege of Congress. She refers to them as hostages. Now, I went back and watched that a second time. You challenge her on a ton of stuff.
Yes.
On the question of whether DOJ had been shown to be collaborating with the White House and the president on charges against Trump and other things. There were a number of things you challenged on. That one sort of went by.
Yeah.
How do you balance the question of letting an interview flow with the need to sort of confront in real time for a couple million viewers these unsubstantiated and at times false declarations being made?
No, it's a great question, and I'm glad you note I did do a lot of fact-checking, and it is a balancing act. If I could go back, I probably would have stopped in that moment. I think one of my goals was to kind of, always every Sunday, is to let people finish their thoughts.
Well, what's wrong with her saying these are hostages if that's her belief?
Well, and of course, the challenge is, first of all, we're actually talking about people being held hostage, in Gaza. So that's A. And then B, obviously, a lot of the people who've been convicted for January 6th have actually, pled guilty to their crimes. So two parts to that.
So it is important in some ways that be rebutted.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, again, I think that it's probably a moment that I would have gone back and maybe addressed a little differently if I could. But I do think it's important to let people finish their thoughts. In that particular moment, there were a lot of thoughts at one time, so I tried to go back and catch up,
Right.
and that may not have been the best strategy in that moment. But look, my goal is to always be fact-checking in real time.
And there was a barrage of assertions being made in that one. Major, there was another incident which was in some ways a step beyond, which was Mary's colleague, George Stephanopoulos, recently was interviewing Senator Vance, J.D. Vance of Ohio, in which he at once initially seemed to be, and then fairly declaratively said that former President Trump, as president, should feel free to ignore Supreme Court decisions, essentially deny the check and balances afforded by the Constitution, Madison v. Marbury and the rest, if they came up with a decision he didn't like. And Stephanopoulos essentially cut short the interview at that point. Mike goes out, they go to break.
Right.
Is that our role? What do you think of that decision?
Well, look, I'm not going to fly spec George Stephanopoulos here or anyplace else. George has earned his reputation as one of the best interlocutors in live television going, full stop. That's his call. He made that call in the moment. I sympathize with Kristen in that moment. I have moderated Face the Nation on a few occasions. It is as a daunting a scenario as you can imagine, especially in the politics of our era now, which our politics of our era now is defined by fire hosing. All right? People do not come on to talk to you, they come on to fire hose. And by that I mean that barrage you talked about is not accidental. It is intentional. It is part of a communication strategy where the interlocutor cannot keep up with everything that is being fire hosed. And if you try, then you are trapped in a feedback loop of stopping, trying to correct, and then them getting mad at you for stopping them from talking and accusing you of silencing them, okay? So it is a balancing act, and it is in real time, and it is mentally tactile. You have to have a feel for that moment and choose the moment in which you lay down the law and say, no, what you just said cannot stand, but you can't say that 15 times in 6 minutes. You simply can't. So one of your last resources is to say, we're done. We're just done. And it goes off and we're going to break. Because I'm not going to deal with this fire hose situation any longer. That is a choice. And George Stephanopoulos is of sufficient weight and credibility to make that choice and to have it stick. And he did. And in that circumstance, I believe that was the best choice.
I think if I do a podcast sometime on political journalism in Washington, I will call it Fly Specking and Fire Hosing. And I think it'd be a great title, I gotta say. You know, there is that question, and on the flip side, there's the question, Jeff Bennett. You know, I get posed, and had it posed to me on Twitter this morning as I was soliciting questions. Mm-hmm. They say, well, given that atmosphere, given the fire hosing, and given the need to respond at the same time for those who are sympathetic to those speaking, for conservative viewers in particular, for pro-Trump voters especially, you know, we feel trust has been frayed or broken with mainstream media, and you see it in all kinds of polls. How do you at once account for this age in which there's a fire hosing, and sometimes that fire hose is filled with things that are intentionally misleading and distorted?
Yeah.
And the need to be able to build bridges so people are you are broadcasting. Mm-hmm. You are reaching a broad audience, and you are able to inform them and allow them to make the decisions they want, but with, you know, information that's grounded in truth.
Yeah. Well, I will say this. The NewsHour audience is a third, a third, and a third. A third independent, a third Republican, and a third Democratic, which is that really, you don't find that anywhere else in the television landscape. And so part of our mandate is to have coverage that reflects the audience that we serve and to bring on guests who span the ideological spectrum. One of the luxuries we have at the NewsHour is that we're not in the 24/7 news business. In fact, it's not a business at all. It's a public service. And so we get to be very deliberate about the stories that we choose to cover and the voices that we choose to elevate. And so there are certain times where, you know, we won't speak to politician X if we don't think that the person's going to engage in good faith, because the goal is to leave our audience with valuable information. Mm-hmm. And so that tends to be our sort of organizing principle around how we do the show. But Major, thank you for what you said in explaining how these interviews happen, because so many people don't understand the way that we work, and so many people who happen to work in other news platforms don't understand how television works. And there can be an assumption of bias, where really there is none, because the American public just doesn't understand how we do the work that we do. So it's important for us to be as transparent as possible and to just throw open the doors so the American public and our viewers can understand how we arrive at coverage decisions that we make.
Mary Bruce, there's a term that's now famous in journalistic circles. It's gotten, I think you mentioned it at one point on your show, if I'm not mistaken, but the New York University journalism professor Jay Rosen says, you know, I really want people to focus not on the odds, but the stakes. Mm-hmm. And Major has pointed out that essentially the horse racing appears to be all but over, and at the same time, the horse race has just begun. We're seeing poll after poll. Who's up? Trump is up here. Biden may have signs of life there. What do you make of Rosen's conceit and the way he frames it in terms of what we should be focusing on?
It's both, I would say. I mean, it's really hard. No, look, you can't just cover every poll like it's Bible, and you can't just be covering the horse race and who's up and who's down. But you can't ignore it either. I think there is an important place for data, that's for sure.
So unpack that just for a moment. Explain why you think that's the case.
Well, take it this way. I think the fact that you have, I by no means am a number person. I can barely add using my hands.
That's why we're journalists.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. But I think there are, trends matter. And when you see, poll after poll showing the fact that Biden and Trump are this close, there's no way that that's not going to have an effect on the way the candidates are operating. There's no way it's going to have not have an impact on the way that this race is being conducted and playing out. That said, I think, and we, certainly lessons were learned from previous races, you can't just sit there and say this person's up, this person's down, because it doesn't, it only matters so much. What is at stake is what matters. And more than that, it's not just what's at stake, it's how does this election matter to you? That is always, I think, the guiding principle. Why does what is happening here in Washington and what's happening around the country matter to you? And how will it change your life? But the conversation of odds versus stakes is one that we have been having a lot this week, as there's been a lot of conversation around the president's age and the Robert Hur report. And it has led to, I can tell you, plenty of debates, plenty of heated conversations with campaign aides and the like, and a lot of, I'm sure a lot of people saw Jon Stewart's take on it as well, but how much to cover the president's age versus to cover what Donald Trump is doing. And I think it's a fascinating conversation, and this last week really crystallized that odds versus stakes debate, because while yes, I'm thinking right now about an email blast that came out from the Biden campaign this week that actually laid out, they counted every minute and every headline that the networks had spent covering the president's age in the Hur report versus what Trump had said about NATO, every minute. And they put it out in an email, in a campaign blast. Their argument being, what's at stake is so much more important than the president's age. Why are you guys focused on this? Well, it does matter. And the president is, a candidate for another 4 years. You can't dismiss that. And you can do both. You can have, important pieces dialing into what Donald Trump said and why that matters, while also looking at the questions of the president's age, which, are equally important. So you can do both. And just because you're focused, you are focused on what's at stake doesn't negate questions about the president's, mental acuity or what was said and alleged in that report.
I just want to mention for those viewing online or on YouTube or on C-SPAN that we'll be taking questions at 1 o'clock, a little over 20 minutes from now, from members of the audience, and we welcome the online audience as well. They're welcome to email questions to media@newslit.org. Kristen Welker.
I was just going to jump off of what Mary said. I do think we always want to be focused on the stakes and the issues. Polls can help us understand what people are thinking and where we are as a country. And one of the things that we found in our polls is that the war in the Middle East is having a real impact on President Biden's presidency. We haven't seen this in decades if you talk to our pollsters. They say, in terms of foreign policy, they say typically it's domestic policy that matters, that people are tuned into. Not the case right now. That helps us understand why you've seen an erosion of support with some of President Biden's youngest supporters, and why voters in Michigan, for example, he's struggling in what is a key state. Someone just said to me the other day, 6 months ago, they would have said Michigan's gone to Biden, but now, not the case. So it does provide, I think, polling an important snapshot for where we are as a country.
Mary mentioned the Hur report, which in some ways, it seems to me encapsulates two potential case studies for us, right? Mm-hmm. One of which is the question of age, and one of which is the question of these comparative records on, in this case, handling of classified documents. You could look at the same report and say, good golly, as a journalist, I have to cover the question. A senior government official on an official document has raised the question of the president's capacity to remember, much less govern. On the other hand, you could say, the special prosecutor's report reflects very much what was found in the case of former Vice President Mike Pence. Essentially, there is no evidence to go to a grand jury to try to secure an indictment, to try to get a conviction subsequently. There is nothing. There are credible, innocent explanations for the things that one could make the argument doesn't look good. And he says that up front, which is an incredible contrast to the former president. How do we balance those things? It does not feel to me as though we were able to, as a press corps generally, really balance two ideas in our head at the same time.
I will just say that, we had in our editorial meetings throughout last week a lot of discussion around that very idea. And we stressed the need to make sure that we were highlighting the differences as they were highlighted in the Hur report between the Biden and Trump cases. I think as a legal matter, that was important. As an editorial matter, that was important just to help our viewers along. And so how do you help your viewers? How do you help the people who are tuning in to gain a deeper understanding of, as you say, these really complicated cases. Why was Trump indicted and Biden wasn't? Obviously, if you've been covering every nuance as we have been, we understand. But for the general public, I do think some of this bleeds together, so we relied on graphics. And we made it very clear in the introduction to the show, here are the differences. And I think making those types of choices and those types of editorial decisions, but having those types of conversations, you're not just throwing everything up against the wall, but you're saying we need to really handle this in a very careful, very thoughtful way, is just critical right now. And it's really encapsulated by the Her report.
Go ahead, Rich.
David, it is a case study in the pushback and the heavy, in the moment scrutiny that basic journalism lives through. If you read the executive summary of the Her report, it says the President of the United States willfully retained classified information.
Right.
What did the President say that night? I did not willfully retain classified information. So you read deeper in the report, and it said, as a charging matter, he didn't. We can't charge him for willfully retaining classified documents. Okay, what's the truth then? The executive summary says he did it. Later it says it's not chargeable. And no one could credibly bring a charge that would be found to produce a guilty verdict based on these facts, mitigating circumstances, memory, and other related issues. So the people who are sympathetic to the president say, what did you say that for? Why did you say he willfully retained classified documents? Well, because it's in the executive summary. That's why we said it.
But Brother Garrett,
we
rely on you to discern these things.
Right, but
us,
I'm just saying, in the name of Jeff Bennett's call for transparency, ladies and gentlemen, don't think this is something you fall out of the bed and can do, all right? It's a 365-page report. And I would just say, parenthetically, for the Trumpists who love this report, read the part about the Presidential Records Act not providing any defense for anyone under any circumstance in this sphere. Oh, you haven't read that part yet? You might want to take a look at it. All I'm saying is that there are a lot of layers to that, and we can be 100% accurate and yet contextually not meet the expectations or demands of those who have an either informed or, let us say, politically shaded perspective on the underlying information. And that's what makes all of this challenging in this particular environment. And that's why I said it is a case study. Yeah. And I'm not saying I want relief from it. I'm not saying I want to back out of it. I'm just saying it's a little harder than it looks.
Just really quickly to add to it, I think, especially in that instance, what I think was so difficult about that day, and that day felt like living 10 lives, was that between when the report came out and when the president actually said he didn't do that, was in our world a lifetime of time. The White House didn't come out and instantly say, that's not true. And they had privileged review of that report, and it wasn't until the next day after all of us had been hounding them that they sent out, the White House counsel spokesman to go through detailed, like page number by page number, refuting that. We did, of course, I think all point out, the executive summary says he willfully retained and disclosed this information, but didn't have enough evidence to charge. Yeah. But to your broader point about this, I think what's, as we, I think, did in every single piece, every time we mentioned this, laying out in detail the difference between the president's handling of classified information and Donald Trump's handling of classified information, I think it's also really clear to do, and we often do these as two separate pieces. There's a legal conversation here and there's a political conversation here, and they are very different. Because what is really mind-blowing at the end of the day is that Donald Trump was charged and somehow politically managed to benefit from the charges, right? To your point, he's out there showing up in court when he doesn't need to be, which we often note, he doesn't have to be there for these things. He is running off of his indictments. Joe Biden was not charged and yet politically is taking a hit for it. And so you have polar opposite legal and political ramifications from these reports, and I think it's really important to not only unpack them, obviously, but to make clear the lens through which you are unpacking this. This is a legal piece, this is a political piece.
Mary Bruce, that is so fascinating to me, and just the very way you framed it is revelatory to me. Is there a world in which that's true, which I think you're right, I'm not contesting that at all. Is there a world in which that's true and the media doesn't have something to do with that?
Of course we have something to do with it.
But I think you have to explain.
So what if I mean, you guys are working your tails off on I know what it is to go through these reports. They are brutal and they are legalistic, and you gotta compare it against other things. But that said, the public doesn't care how hard we have to work. The public just cares what we provide, right?
It's also important to understand and remember that the laws of political physics have never applied to Donald Trump, and understanding why. Chris Christie has this great story where he was in Iowa going door to door with his wife. And this woman let him into her house and said, "Oh, I love you so much, and your wife, you're so amazing, you're such a truth teller, da, 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 da." Brings him into the living room, serves up tea, and offers food, the whole thing. And so at the end of this 45 minutes in this woman's living room, he says, "Well, can I count in your vote?" And she goes, "Oh, no, darling, you can't. You're a politician. I'm voting for Donald Trump. He's not a politician." Even after he had been president for 4 years. Like, that's still not the standard by which people judge him. They still think he's a businessman who's going to stick it to the man and fight for, everyday Americans. And so that, when Christie said that, it was like, well, you can't compete with that. You honestly can't. And if that's the metric by which his supporters are judging him and viewing all of the 91 counts in the 4 criminal cases, there's only so much we can do as journalists when you encounter a wall like that.
But Jeff, to your point, the NewsHour has shown you can do certain things. Right now, NewsHour allows things to breathe a little bit more. It does not have the imperatives of commercials in the same way, and it's run by different logic and imperatives. But nonetheless, there was, it was pointed to me, I guess, online last night, this morning, there's something like a 7-minute segment you guys did on the question of age, encompassing both candidates. Because let's remember from 2016, back then our minds were being blown on a regular basis by what Trump had to say, and people said, oh, he's just, erratic, or he's not polished and professional as a politician, so he's saying different things. And only were there hints here and now where people would frame it the question of, is he firm, is he fit, is he compos mentis? Sometimes people would throw things at him that seemed to me to be violating the contemporary canons of psychology and professionalism, no doubt, but nonetheless, less frequently framed in that way. But nonetheless, you guys spoke to a bunch of senior citizen voters about their perspectives about what age meant. And they had a very interesting and textured and varied thoughts on it. And then you talked to 2 experts in the field of aging about it and about the question of memory and what it shows. And they didn't really go after either of the 2 candidates, but they talked about things to look for and things not, the distinction, for example, one of them made between misremembering an important thing in your family's life, like, for example, a death in terms of a date, and having trouble remembering that it occurred. And so that was interesting to me for both candidates, a kind of a little bit of buffer forgiveness for age, but also recognition that it was something to watch for, and a very serious concern.
Yeah, and the case when President Biden swapped the names for the presidents of Mexico and Egypt, what does that actually mean? And does that suggest that he's doesn't have the capacity to make serious decisions as president of the United States?
But similarly, not to do that to Trump about Nikki Haley and Pelosi offhandedly while speaking without a teleprompter.
That's right. That's right. And to give you a sense of how that discussion came to be, it was after Nikki Haley raised the issue of Donald Trump's mental acuity that we had in our editorial meeting a long discussion about, well, how do we represent this on the program? The NewsHour obviously is an hour-long program. Our editorial meetings are in many cases an hour long. Not necessarily the most efficient process, but it's because we do have, to your point, robust conversations about the issues and the stories that matter. And so it really took a week for the producers to find the right guests and to put out call-outs on social media for people who wanted to come on. And these were all people, I think, who were 75 and above, who talked about, how age has manifested in their own lives. Do they have memory issues, or what do they think about the fact that the president would be the oldest president ever if he's reelected? And that then followed the conversation with the 2 experts. And so all told, it was about, 7 to 9 minutes, I think, of TV time. Time in television is the finite resource. The NewsHour, we happen to have more of it. But that, to your point, is I think, the lane that we play in that I think often complements what the big 3 networks do.
So I want to ask about something which may seem off the point, but I think gets at the point in a slightly different angle. Maybe, Kristen, if you want to hop on this. I don't think there's probably a single one of our outlets up here that could say hasn't covered Taylor Swift in a significant way in recent weeks and months, right? And as part of a different conversation than simply as a pop sensation. USA Today has now devoted a beat reporter to this, as I understand it. She's considered an NFL sensation. You saw Roger Goodell making sure to go over and talk to her. He better have been thanking her. There better be comp tickets because she's pumping up a lot of viewers and a lot of sales.
CBS thanks her, just for
Yeah.
the record.
No, that's right.
Yeah, I bet.
And we appreciate that. Now, a new poll from Monmouth shows that nearly 1 in 5% of respondents believe she is part of a conspiracy to help Joe Biden get reelected. What does that say about our coverage and our moment?
Well, we've spoken to some of our guests about the conspiracy. I asked Chris Christie about this very thing on Sunday.
Not a conspiracist.
Not a conspiracy theorist. And he dismissed it and talked about how disappointing it is. I do think, and this speaks to the enormous responsibility that we have as journalists to make sure that, especially in the face of conspiracy theories, that we are providing people with facts. It speaks to the pervasiveness of online content and the extent to which people can believe what they see online, which is why it's so important to have safeguards online as well, and why it is important. We talked about, should we talk about this conspiracy theory? We decided to because of that very reason, because of how pervasive it is. And to hear someone like Chris Christie dismiss it, we thought was also incredibly significant. So
one of the reasons I was particularly taken by that is if you go into the weeds on that study, I'll say this, 42% of the respondents who believe in it, or at least who say they believe in it, let's say that, said they had never heard the theory until they were asked by Monmouth University. So, there are studies out there that show, and news literacy has been interested in this, that, pre-budding things, that is, that if there's stuff out there on the fringes, sometimes having professional reporters and broadcasters go out and say, listen, there's this thing out there, we want you to understand that it's not true, here's what the allegations are, here's why it's not true, doing a sandwich and saying, folks, don't do this, that there's a value in this thing called pre-budding rather than simply trying to catch up and rebutting. On the other hand, if 42% of the people who say they believe in this crazy conspiracy hadn't heard it until it was introduced to them by a question, are we somehow introducing bad information into the mainstream? How do we balance that?
Well, I think that is the critical question. Like, how do you make sure, because that's actually fascinating that people are that quick to say, okay, yes, I believe it.
Let's go.
Sounds good. And I think it also speaks to the pervasiveness of conspiracy theories. Think about how many different conspiracy theories are out there and why, we've had conversations about how to address the Taylor Swift conspiracy theory for a couple of weeks now. We finally decided to when we found the right way to do it, but I think we're always testing ourselves, like, are we addressing it quickly enough to dispel it enough when there is a conspiracy theory like that, which, by the way, can be dangerous and damaging to the people that it's about. So I do think there's a huge responsibility to kind of address it head on and to not be afraid of saying, like, okay, let's get out there so that people have heard of it, so that when that person calls them, they know why or why not to believe something that they've read online.
What do you think, Major?
So it's also a case study in a couple of things that I think are flowing through our politics. One, we typically use the term we are a divided nation. I'm not really sure that applies any longer or applies in a robust enough way. I think there is a deeper sense of alienation that is more psychologically important than the idea that we differ on things. We've long, as a nation, differed on things. I think there is an aspect of our politics now that we need to take on board that is much deeper than we disagree about things. We are alien. We feel less alike about ourselves as Americans. We feel alienated from those with whom we disagree with. And because of that, that creates a sense of not just we're disagreeing about something or we have a different approach, but we are more prone, even when introduced something we haven't heard before, to believe there's something threatening about it, or that somebody is in charge of something that could make me unhappy or make my life less enjoyable, because I feel alienated either from the culture or from the larger forces around me or from people who I disagree with politically. That's one aspect that I think is captured by that. Another is that these things are all changeable we have confused polling data as a predictive data set. It is not a predictive data set. Polling measures attitudes, not necessarily behavior. People can have an attitude about something in the moment. It's not necessarily fixed, and it's not necessarily going to inform their behavior. We have seen plenty of polls in special elections and in the midterm elections that suggested one active behavior, and the behavior was different because people had an attitude, but when push came to shove, they behaved differently. And I think that is one of the things, as we do the horse race part of this, we have to constantly remind ourselves. Polls are not fixed data sets that predict or that capture predictable behavior. Mm-hmm. They capture attitudes at a fixed time with a fixed set of facts. And this poll captured part of that alienation and part of something that might be true, I might be concerned about, and a week from now I might have completely forgotten.
Though I feel like there was a time when you'd see polls that said something like 22 or 26% of the nation thought the Holocaust didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And you know, there was some social science suggests that wasn't really people believing it. It's a way of sticking, being hostile in some ways to forces that they felt, either being anti-Semitic or to forces that they felt were arrayed against them in some ways.
Absolutely.
You know? And so it's not always clear to me the polls express exactly what they say they're expressing.
Another cautionary sign.
Jeff Bennett, you know, whether through the lens of PBS NewsHour or just through thinking about this profession more broadly, you've of course worked at NPR, you've worked at NBC, you've thought about this from a number of different perspectives. What does fairness mean right now at a time where candidates and certainly bases of the two parties are not only seem as though they're living in different eras, they're operating in different realities?
Yeah. Well, look, you know, our job, and this has become clear over the last, I'd say, 5 years or so, is to be dedicated truth tellers. We cannot be stenographers or megaphones for any candidate. And what it means, you know, even though, you know, currently an anchor of a broadcast, I still, in my heart, am a reporter. And so if there's any story that I'm covering, I'm still doing the same sourcing. I'm still making the same number of phone calls as I did when I was doing hits on Capitol Hill or at the White House. And so this issue of fairness, whatever story it is, I think the way you get to that is by doing the reporting and by doing the prep and by trying to get to the core of whatever that issue or story is. And I think, you know, at the end of it, whatever semblance of truth you can divine from that reporting, I think that informs your coverage.
I want to now start the open question period of our time. Our folks have been not only generous with their time, they're giving us a little overtime to have some questions. I think that the way this works is that I get to point to the questioner and each of you will be given a microphone, but I also want to remind those of our viewers who are watching online or on C-SPAN to make sure they can email questions to media@newslit.org. That's NEWSLIT.org. Let's start with this gentleman here at this table in the center. Maybe tell us your first name, and if you have a question for a particular person, feel free to identify that.
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Button, and I have a question about silos and audiences. And you folks at CBS, NBC, NPR, and PBS, it's possible that your audience base might be different from the good folks who watch Fox and Newsmax. So how do you folks take into consideration the reality that the good and wholesome reporting that you provide is not going to a whole lot of folks who might really benefit from hearing your perspectives?
Kristen Walker.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the idea, and it's such a wonderful question, the importance of hearing from a diverse set of voices, even when it's complex, even when it's challenging, making sure that we are bringing on voices who speak to those audiences, making sure that we're giving those guests time to speak and figuring out, you know, how to navigate in real time, giving people time, and also doing the necessary fact-checking in real time. I think it's about respecting our audiences, respecting them enough to know that if we do our job, if we do our work, the reporting, the fact-checking, that they will do their work as citizens. And it really is about trusting our audiences and making sure that we are hearing from people all across the political spectrum, even when it's hard and complicated.
And look, we can't account for the opt-out process.
Yeah.
We can't. We can only account for the opt-in, all right? We produce, and as Jeff has mentioned several times, we have intense editorial conversations starting in the morning, midday, and then again right before broadcast, constantly going over what we're doing and why we're doing it. Are we thinking of everything? Are we asking the right questions? And then we start that process again the very next day. Always looking for the maximum opt-in of the audience. But we can't service those who have decided to opt out. And if you're watching Newsmax, you've opted out. You have said legacy media, mainstream media, whatever, you don't meet my needs.
Can I push back just a tiny
Sure.
bit, though? Because we live in an age where things are not only excerpted on other outlets, often as fodder either against the people you're interviewing or your outlets themselves, but they're also blasted on social media.
Sure.
And your employers are all using whatever they can, you know, certainly sometimes on X, but you know, TikTok or Insta or wherever,
everything.
to try to YouTube to reach people in
Yeah.
a million myriad ways now.
Right.
So you are actually trying to figure out where people are and trying to get them at the same time.
Of course, but to the gentleman's question, if you're a dedicated Newsmax watcher, you're not going to be someone even inclined, even if something comes in the side door of your feed through Instagram or Facebook or X or TikTok, and it says CBS on it, you have already decided, probably not, okay? My hope is, and my belief is, over time that will change. But we can't change it in time. We can only do what we can in the moment, based on all of our best efforts on a day-to-day basis to produce the most durable, factual, contextual news every single day. And the opt-out factor is not something commercially we can weigh. It's certainly out there. It's a reality. And we will, at the margins, hope that they come back, but we cannot operationally try to chase them back in.
One of the ways in which I think we can maybe not chase them, but try to entice a broader range of viewers is through streaming and on social media. And one of the things we're really proud of at NBC is we have invested in our streaming platform, News Now. I have Meet the Press Now, for example, during the week. And that lives on people's phones. Mm-hmm. My mom's always like, how do I find you at this platform? But I do think that's a way, as Major is saying, like, you know, for the Newsmax viewer, maybe they see a piece of that feed and that, you know, and that kind of reaches someone who may not be intentionally tuning in. And I do think that's just such a critical part of reaching a broader audience, a younger audience,
and we do
a more
that
diverse
at
audience.
CBS on streaming with
absolutely,
America Decides.
absolutely.
And that's where you'll find the preponderance of our voters' voices.
Yes.
We run that on a regular basis. But again, that's all within our construct of how we're approaching the story. And all I'm saying is, and don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying this audience is not someone we would like to have back, but we can't start the day saying, well, what are we going to do to satisfy those who are watching Newsmax? We can't do it that way. We just can't.
Yeah, I think the antidote to disinformation and misinformation from a 30,000-foot level is more good information. Yeah. And that's what we're all dedicated to.
That stands the test of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It feels to me at once absolutely vital and indispensable and not adequate to dealing with the fire hose that Major described.
Yeah,
it seems like both of those things are true at the same time. We had a question over here, I think this gentleman, front table. Yes. Wait one moment so that folks can hear you. We got a microphone coming your way. You know, I'm from the world of audio. We all care about good sound.
My name's Peter Kadzik, and you know, when I see these interviews with voters and people on the street, I sometimes wonder, like, what dumpster or mental institution did you scourge to come up with these people? Like, how do you pick these people? Because it seems like a lot of them aren't really living in the same world I'm living in.
Mary, do you want to hop in on that?
I'm laughing thinking about how many hours I have spent gathering MOS, man on the street interviews. I think it's a rite of passage for all of us. And it's tough. Look, I think some people would say, you know, why does it matter what this one person, you know, on the other side of the country who happened to be, you know, walking out of this coffee shop, why does this one voice matter? And I think the point is when you are doing this right and you are out there gathering, you know, a sampling of voices, I'm not saying it's a pure science, but the hope is that you get at least a taste of what matters
Yeah.
to people, right? And I think if I'm getting sort of into the real micro level, if I'm going out there to talk to folks, you know, the president's giving a speech in Ohio, and we want to go out and just get a sense of what people are thinking. It's not just standing there spending 5 minutes on a street corner grabbing whoever you can. It's, you know, from the second I land, I'm talking to the Uber driver, I'm talking to the person in the hotel, I'm getting a sample, and that's all off camera, you know, of what people are thinking, what matters to them. Well, you know, the president's here to talk about this, what issue matters to you? And oftentimes it's something completely different. And then hoping you get a sense of that on camera and making sure that you get a diverse viewpoint on camera. And that can be really hard. I mean, trust me, we all know the second you say, you know, hi, I'm Mary Broussard from ABC, certain people will just say, nope, and turn and walk right away. I mean, there's no more humbling experience than going out there and trying to talk to folks, but you hope that it gives you some kind of semblance and sense. And I certainly hope it doesn't feel like there are people that we found in a dumpster. We try, that's usually not where, we don't really like to hang out behind the dumpster. I'm not saying I haven't done some dumpster diving, but you hope that you get a sense of, wow, this is someone, you know, who may live in a very different part of the country, who may live a very different life from mine. And these are the issues that matter to them. And this is where I have a similarity with them. This is where, you know, our interests differ, but it does at least give you a taste. And oftentimes, what's most beneficial is that it lets us then come back to the briefing room and say, you know what, the president was hammering on this point, but over and over again, that's not what's resonating with the people we talk to. You know, this is the message you guys are trying to get out, but they're not feeling that. You know, when they sit down at their kitchen table, you know, the economic message that you're hammering home, that's not hitting their bank account, their wallets, or whatever the issue may be. It's really a chance for us to get out there and do the most basic fundamental part of the job, which is speak to Americans and come back and pose their questions to the people, their elected officials.
And I do think there's an intentionality to it. I mean, we typically are, you know, in a swing state, in a swing district, trying to talk to a diverse set of voices, so that, again, we can bring a patchwork of, you know, thoughts and perspectives to all of you, to our viewers.
And I would say all of us here are generationally informed by the heroes we looked up to. One of mine was David Broder.
Yeah.
Another was Jack Germond. I believe this is accurately attributed to Jack Germond. If it's not, I apologize. But there's a famous saying in journalism, and I believe it came from Jack Germond, which goes like this. There is nothing that will discourage a reporter more about the future of American democracy than talking to an average American voter. What he meant by that was, and I've experienced this, Mary made reference to it, I've gone to county fairs, I've gone to state fairs, and you will talk to 20 people, maybe 2 are dialed into a race that's a year away. Maybe 2 of 20, but you have to talk and introduce yourself to 20 to get 2 semi-useful quotes because they're kind of dialed in. It's much easier in a primary or caucus state where things are ramping up, and even then, it's a little uneven. And as Mary said, lots of people do not want to talk to reporters or don't want to talk about politics, even if they themselves are interested in. Here's my reference to David Broder. David Broder, for years, canvassed the way political campaigns canvass. He would pick a specific neighborhood of political importance in a city or a county, and he would knock on doors, every single door. He would canvass the way campaigns do. He stopped doing that later in his career because people would stop opening their door. They were too nervous about it. But he found that an enormously valuable way to inform his columns and his overall perspective about where things were. So I learned from that process, and I have come to admire it, but it is difficult, and it sometimes leaves viewers like you less than fully satisfied about what you're hearing, but we still endeavor to do it because we know one thing. Sitting in our offices won't get it done. It may be imperfect, but it's better than sitting in our office.
You know, I'll say one thing, Major Garrett. You know, I worked with Jack Germond, and I sat 10 feet from Jack Germond at the Baltimore Sun, Washington Bureau, and he absolutely said that.
Okay, good.
That is 100% senator. What I would say to Peter, although I'm just the moderator, so I shouldn't say anything, is a small defense of the person that you're seeing on some of those things. I think we typically tend to learn things from talking to folks, even if they may set your hair on fire. There are times where only the most inflammatory folks are put on the air, or just the briefest of clips, but that if you were actually sit down with them at their kitchen table, they might tell you more about their lives. I remember a guy who I talked to in New Hampshire in 2016 who was a total Bernie Sanders guy, and then sort of he cocked his head at me and said, but you know what, if he loses, I think I'm going to vote for that guy Trump. And I said, why? He's like, I just want to torch the place. And so we sat and talked about, how drugs had ravaged his family and how he felt people weren't responsive, and he just wanted it different. And that, on the one hand, I'm not sure I would put him in charge of daycare for my kids. But on the other hand, I thought it was instructive and illuminating, and he was dealing with some real stuff. And so it's worth remembering that. We try to do that as well. Let's take another question from here, and then I'll try a couple from the watching online. Who we got? Right here, this woman here, please.
Hi, I'm just wondering, as journalists, what do you feel like the balance is between informing and educating? Because I'm thinking about how many people even know what NATO stands for? Or I've seen in my home state people voting against their own best interest because they don't understand what Obamacare is, or they don't understand how school choice is going to affect their small community. So where do you feel like the balance is between informing people how something's going to play out versus just reporting what political people are saying about it?
Jeff, why don't you hop in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As someone who did a 7-minute segment last night on the election in Indonesia, which it honestly really depends on the topic. And so, for instance, I'll use as an example the Indonesia story I did last night. The reason we thought it was important to do was because of the influence of the Indo-Pacific and the fact that the U.S. and China are so heavily invested in that region. And democracy in Indonesia was hard won after decades of an authoritarian regime. And so what does that mean for that country, and what does that mean big picture? So a lot of that was an education, because I knew that most of our viewing audience didn't have any foundation for this kind of conversation. And so I was very intentional about writing the introduction. We were super intentional about finding the right guest who could bring a conversation like that to life, because you want it to be informative and educational, but it also has to be watchable. And so, that tends to be our sort of organizing principle around those sort of arcane, off the beaten path conversations.
I think to add to that point, I'm just thinking about the conversations I've had on this very topic this week. Sometimes you can assume, okay, the audience has a basic understanding. We think the audience knows what NATO is. They understand this alliance. They understand how we look out for each other. But David mentioned this earlier. They may not understand how your dues or your responsibilities, right? You don't owe dues. No one owes the U.S. money, but you have made certain defense spending commitments. And it turns out the majority of countries haven't actually made that commitment. And so to fact check how this actually operates. And we did have a back and forth conversation. Do we need to explain Article 5? Do we not? How much do people really know about it?
Do we need to explain what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is?
Yes.
Or as we used to put it in our newsroom, the famous rock and roll band, the Rolling Stones.
Right. Yeah.
How much are you explaining? How much are you not?
And then you do, with some storylines, if a storyline is long enough, then at some point you realize, okay, the audience, they tend to stick with you. So, okay, we've now explained for 2 weeks what this issue is. We think they get it. Now maybe we no longer have to shorthand the famous rock and roll band. We can just say the Stones or the Rolling Stones. We can, how to abbreviate. But you hope that some buildup does happen. But I think any time, especially at the beginning of a story, and I think there's no harm in overdoing it, in making sure that, hey, why not explain what NATO is just to be safe, and then you can move ahead. But it's a constant balancing act, and it is a conversation that we do have often.
We've had those conversations in our Meet the Press editorial meetings because we are dealing with such complicated issues. And yes, in this latest NATO news, but also as we've been covering the war in the Middle East. I was meeting with a group of folks on Capitol Hill who said sometimes we hear from our constituents and they feel left behind in the coverage, like they can't keep up. And I think educating, and the previous moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck, used to always talk about this, education is core to what we do. And so we try to really challenge ourselves. Okay, we understand this issue because we've been covering it for several days now, or we've been reading about it, whatever it is. But do we need to just take a couple more steps for our viewers? So we have, as of late, really been trying to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind when we're talking about these really complicated issues.
Go ahead.
And that's where the streaming platform for NBC, for ABC, for CBS, add space for that.
Yeah.
And I will just say this. Jeff has said this twice now to make us feel terrible.
Yeah.
Seven-minute pieces.
We never get
Okay.
7-minute pieces.
That's 2.5, maybe 3 evening news pieces.
It is,
Okay.
yes.
Oh, yeah.
So just keep rubbing it in, my brother.
Well,
Just
because
keep rubbing it in.
having spent so much time and you have a minute to tell this complex story, and then when you get out to do your live shot, you have 45 seconds to, so.
But that does get to the question of informing versus educating, because when you only, I mean, my piece last night it's a minute and 30 seconds.
Right.
So how much of that time are you going to spend unpacking what is what, and when is it really important to make sure, hey, we need to reset and make sure you understand how this operates, and then we can move along with the story.
So challenge a little bit the premise that we're here on today, right? Particularly to Major and Mary here, if you might, given what you're talking about, the limitations of the forum, given declining television audiences for legacy outlets, is countering misinformation, is providing focus on stakes rather than the odds, is unpacking and educating as well as informing about the latest incremental event. Do those things move the needle on the public's understanding of what's happening?
We can only hope that they will and that they do, and that the accumulated effort builds out in pursuit of that mission. One thing we're doing at CBS for this election year and after this election year, typically we've had a segment that's longstanding as part of the CBS Evening News called Eye on America. That has for many, many years been once a week. Very soon it's going to be 5 times a week. So that's a piece that is not driven by the day's news. It is either an investigatory piece or a deeper dive piece on any particular issue or circumstance. Maybe something that was hot 2 weeks ago and we're going back to it. But anyway, that's building out a part of the broadcast in ways that try to meet that explanatory part of journalism or a deeper assessment of something. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing that. I, on occasion, anchor for Norah O'Donnell as a substitute, and I'm always happier when the broadcast has an Eye on America piece, because it's not just, oh, there's a piece of B-roll about a storm or a plane or something that you won't remember a week from now, but a piece like that you might remember, it might add value. And I know everyone in this industry, whether it's Jeff at PBS NewsHour or ABC or NBC, are always trying to find ways within that fixed amount of time to build out more, to tell more, to explain more, and to have something that is memorable and durable. And it's our life's pursuit.
So Major, I mean,
we'll stay at it.
Does it make you guys ever think, you know what, given the moment, given cable, given the web, given social media, maybe one of these, or maybe any number of these 30-minute conventional newscasts that are really about 19 to 21-minute conventional newscasts?
22 to 23 and a half.
Well, there you go. They'd like to sell more ads, all of us, but nonetheless. Is there a sense in which maybe the incremental shouldn't be covered that night? Maybe they should all be done in a way in which it's like, all right, these are just going to be longer looks at things that you want to know about, or that you would be curious about if only you were aware, as you memorably put it earlier.
Yeah, that conversation is constant, and it is I don't want to say a losing conversation, but it is a competitively informed conversation, okay?
In the news business.
In the news business, yeah, because we're all trying to find and hold audience, and we try to do things that are distinctive and that last, and sometimes to do that choice, to make that choice, to not do the incremental or the flashy story of the day and take longer time, well, look, you'll get a meter reading instantaneously, second by second, of what the audience is doing. And executives are held to account for what the audience does and what your competition does.
The audience registers what you just said. This is totally true. It's really true in cable, right? But this is true for you guys at the nightly news as well. They have the ability to discern within basically how many seconds?
We have by the second.
By the second of whether you're tuning in or out.
Yeah.
If somebody's face comes on, whether that photograph is discouraging people for staying tuned to the XBS nightly news or whatever it is.
Right. So, and look, I think I would have preferred an era when it was more intuitive and less data-driven, but those things are not ignorable within the industry. and the competitive pressures and the competitive environment inform these decisions. Do we press against them? I would say, on behalf of my network, Eye on America is a way to press against that, to say, no, damn it, we're going to lay this down, and we're going to have this distinctive thing that you can rely on every night of the week, and we're going to lay out 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes, and we're going to see where it goes, and we're going to invest in that to differentiate. There is a commitment there, but there is also a risk there, because that dial may not always work productively on that story. It may not, but we're gonna live with that, and that's a decision we've made from the top down. But I will just say, all of these conversations are not abstractly and only journalistic, and I wish I could tell you all that they are. Wish I could lie to your face and say it's all just about the holy concept and construct of journalism. It isn't. There is a dynamic about it that is not only competitive, but business and audience. And your audience preferences are a feedback loop to us, and you tell us what you like and what you don't like, and we weigh that. We are informed by it, and if anyone tells you that we're not, they're lying to you, and I'm not going to stand up here and lie to you.
And this from a gentleman who's wearing socks with unicorns and rainbows.
That's right.
They're great.
Mary Bruce, you wanted to
two
join
quick
us.
points. One, which is, I think, to your question about not wanting to do the incremental. I do think, to play devil's advocate there a bit, we are all aware that everyone has all of this instantly all day on their phone. So the goal, at 6:30, and that we've been talking about it all day on streaming, is not just to do, hey, this is what happened in the last hour, but, to put the day into a bigger context and a bigger picture with all of the information that may have been lost when all day long you're inundated with, like, this happened and that happened and that happened and that, and to draw that through line through the day. And I keep thinking about what you mentioned about weighing, how when you have such limited time, what to do with it. And do you just wish you could, sometimes focus on different things? I think we would always rather, do one thing really well than a lot of things poorly. And I think it's a decision that we make very consciously. And it can be not satisfying. I mean, every day I am begging, 10 more seconds, 5 more seconds, please. And you don't understand how, it's everything is important. Everyone wants that time. But we will spend time at the end of a piece, and it may seem odd going back and revisiting something you just heard, even though it's like, well, why would you spend a precious 25 seconds going back and really hammering home what you just told me? It's because you want to make sure that it really lands. And if in coming out of a piece, you've heard the back and forth, you've heard what the senator said, the president, the press secretary, if coming out of that, David Muir and I, our anchor, can have another 30, 45 seconds to really unpack it and say, no, this is really what happened with the border funding getting stripped out of the Ukraine bill, and now we're back where we started. That's worth the time, rather than adding another 45 seconds that takes you in another direction but may kind of get glossed over.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to make sure to take I'll take a question from Alan Miller, because how can I not? He's the father of the News Literacy Project.
Thanks very much, David. And thank you all for such an illuminating conversation. I want to ask you, it's fair to say that partisans on both sides of this election feel that the stakes are incredibly high. It's often said it may be the most consequential election in our lifetime. I'd like to hear from each of you, how do you see those stakes, and how will that be reflected in your coverage?
Why don't we start with Kristen Welker here? I don't know that each will have time to do it, but I want to get sort of an in-depth answer and allow you to address that.
Well, we always say this is the most important election of our times for so many, and as journalists, I think we believe that every election cycle, and for so many reasons this election is going to be, I think, critical. So we are taking that into account, taking that deadly seriously every week, every single day. And for example, we're coming off of a week where there have been a lot of developments on Capitol Hill, a lot of developments on the campaign trail, and we need to cover all of it. And we need to make sure that we're educating people about those developments, putting them into context. But I think we send a message to our audience that we are taking this seriously, and hopefully you will too, by, we never leave out what's happening on the campaign trail, for example. That's always a key part of our coverage, even when there are developments overseas or on the Hill. So I think we send that signal by really putting a spotlight on it.
Well, can I just ask one quick follow-up, and I think that'll then wrap us up for the afternoon. Let's say you concluded, hypothetically, President Biden is not able to discharge his duties because of his health or his age. Let's say, for example, you conclude former President Trump is not fit to hold office as proven by his actions in office and at the tail end. And you conclude that because you think journalistically the facts support it. And you can make that case. What do you do with that insight?
Well,
to what degree do you, I'm not talking about as a private voter, I'm talking about as a public journalist. What do you do with that in terms of serving your audience?
I would say I don't see that as my job as a journalist to make those types of final determinations about the candidates. Our job as journalists is to do the hard reporting, to ask the hard questions, of those who are running, of those who already hold power, and to give our audience as Jeff said, the best version of the truth, the best set of facts, so that they can make that final decision for themselves. I think that once we get into the arena of trying to make a final determination like that, we've, in some ways, I think, crossed a line.
And with that, that'll be the final word. I'd like us to have a moment to thank Kristen Welker, Major Garrett, Mary Bruce, and Jeff Bennett for joining us on what is an incredibly busy time. Thank you very much, guys. Pleasure. And thank you to the News Literacy Project for putting this on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.